The worst lie anyone has ever told about me lasted less than 30 seconds, but it destroyed my reputation in front of 43 members of my own family. It happened during my mother's 70th birthday party, just as everyone finished singing and the candles were still glowing on her cake. My older sister, Claire, stood up with a champagne glass in one hand and a smile that made everyone expect a heartfelt toast. Instead, she looked directly at me and laughed. "Before Mom opens any presents," she said loudly, "I think we should all thank Emily for finally remembering she has a mother." The room erupted in laughter almost instantly because everyone thought it was harmless sibling teasing. Then Claire reached over, picked up the velvet jewelry box containing the necklace I had spent 6 months saving to buy, held it high enough for every table to see, and added, "Amazing what people are willing to spend when they think an inheritance is finally getting close." The laughter stopped, but not because anyone disagreed. They stopped because they wanted to see whether I would deny it. I didn't say a word, and my silence only convinced everyone Claire must be telling the truth. My cousins exchanged knowing looks across the room. My uncle slowly shook his head, and even my husband's expression shifted from confusion to quiet concern as he searched my face for an explanation I couldn't seem to give. Claire had always understood one thing better than anyone else in our family. People believe the person who speaks first, especially when the accusation confirms what they already suspect. I lived almost 3 hours away in Nashville, where I worked 12-hour shifts as a pediatric oncology nurse. Claire lived 15 minutes from Mom's house. To the rest of the family, that simple fact explained everything. Of course Claire was the devoted daughter. Of course I was the one who only appeared on birthdays and holidays. Distance had quietly become evidence, and over the years, Claire had built an entire story around it, while I kept convincing myself the truth would eventually speak for itself. Then she decided humiliation alone wasn't enough. She walked toward me until only a few feet separated us, turned back toward the crowd, and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed every sentence. "Do you know how many times Emily visited Mom this year?" she asked, pausing just long enough for several relatives to shrug their shoulders. "3. 3 visits in 12 months. Meanwhile, I've driven Mom to every doctor's appointment, handled every grocery trip, paid bills when she forgot, stayed overnight after every medical procedure, and listened whenever she needed someone to talk to." Several people nodded immediately because Claire posted photographs after almost every visit. There were smiling selfies in waiting rooms, pictures of grocery bags beside Mom's kitchen table, captions thanking everyone for their prayers after appointments, and cheerful updates about spending another afternoon helping around the house. Looking at those posts, anyone would have believed Claire had practically become Mom's full-time caregiver. Listening to her now, I realized those carefully crafted pictures had been preparing this moment for years. The cruelest part wasn't that Claire was lying. It was that I had helped her do it. 11 years earlier, after one particularly ugly argument between us, Mom took my hand and made me promise something. "Never compete over who loves me more," she whispered. "Families that start keeping score never stop." I took that promise seriously. Every time I quietly paid one of Mom's utility bills online without telling anyone, I stayed silent. Every time I arranged transportation to a specialist while Claire accepted everyone's gratitude, I stayed silent. When Mom's roof needed emergency repairs after a storm, and I wired the money directly to the contractor because I couldn't leave work, I stayed silent. I never corrected relatives who congratulated Claire for sacrifices she hadn't made because I believed protecting Mom's peace mattered more than protecting my own reputation. Sitting in that dining room, listening to my sister transform my silence into proof that I only cared about an inheritance, I began wondering whether keeping that promise had been the biggest mistake of my life. Claire wasn't finished. She placed the unopened necklace back beside Mom's birthday cake, folded her arms, and smiled at me with unmistakable satisfaction. "Go ahead, Emily," she said sweetly. "Tell everyone I'm lying. Tell them you've been taking care of Mom all this time. Show them one piece of proof." I looked around the room, hoping to find even one face willing to doubt her story, but every expression reflected the same uncomfortable uncertainty. Nobody called me a liar, yet nobody defended me either. They simply waited. That silence hurt far more than Claire's words, because it reminded me how easily years of quiet sacrifice can disappear when someone else tells a louder story. I finally turned toward Mom, expecting her to end the argument before it became any uglier. Instead, she remained completely still, her eyes moving slowly from Claire to me before settling on the old oak china cabinet that had stood in the corner of our dining room for as long as I could remember. Without saying a single word, Mom stood up from her chair and walked across the room so quietly that the only sound came from the floorboards beneath her slippers. She ignored the birthday cake, devopened presents, and every confused face watching her. Opening the cabinet, she reached past the family photo albums and the fine china we used only on holidays, until her hand disappeared into the very back of the bottom shelf. A few seconds later, she pulled out a thick black leather book tied shut with a faded blue ribbon that looked old enough to have been sitting there for decades. I had never seen it before. Neither, judging by the sudden panic spreading across Claire's face, had anyone else in the room. My sister took one involuntary step forward before stopping herself, her confident smile vanishing so completely that she looked like a different person. For the first time that afternoon, she wasn't trying to control the room. She was terrified. In a voice barely above a whisper, she stared at the leather book and said, "It wasn't an angry gesture. It was calm, almost gentle." Somehow that frightened my sister far more than if Mom had raised her voice. "I never intended for anyone else to read this," Mom said quietly, looking around the room rather than at either of her daughters. "I started writing in it 12 years ago because my doctor warned me that memory doesn't always stay as reliable as we'd like. He told me to keep notes about appointments, medications, visitors, and anything important enough that I might someday question whether I remembered it correctly." Several relatives leaned forward in their chairs. Claire quickly folded her arms and smiled again, though I could see the tension around her eyes. "That's exactly what I've been saying," she replied. "I've been helping you with all those things for years." Mom nodded once. "Yes," she answered softly. "You helped me sometimes." Claire relaxed just enough to believe the conversation had turned back in her favor. Then Mom added, "Emily helped me too." The room remained quiet because that wasn't surprising. What surprised everyone was the way Mom carefully emphasized the word "too," as though it carried far more weight than anyone yet understood. My Aunt Linda, who had always been the unofficial referee at family gatherings, finally broke the silence. "Margaret," she asked cautiously, "what exactly are we looking at?" Mom slowly opened the leather cover, revealing page after page of neat blue handwriting organized by dates rather than stories. Every month had its own divider. Every entry followed the same simple pattern: date, appointment, visitor, notes. Nothing looked emotional or dramatic. It resembled the careful records of someone who feared forgetting ordinary moments more than extraordinary ones. Claire laughed again, louder this time. "See?" she said, looking around the room. "It's basically a planner." Mom turned several pages before stopping somewhere near the middle of the book. "Would you read the date at the top, Claire?" she asked. My sister glanced down almost carelessly. "October 14th, she answered. 3 years ago." Mom nodded. "Please read the rest." Claire's confidence disappeared, sentence by sentence. At first, her voice remained steady. "Emily drove me to Vanderbilt for my cardiology appointment because Claire had a work meeting." She hesitated briefly before continuing. "Emily paid for the prescription refill on the way home. She asked me not to mention it because she didn't want Claire feeling guilty." Claire stopped reading altogether. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Mom didn't say anything. She simply waited. Finally, my Uncle Robert cleared his throat. "Keep reading," he said gently. Claire swallowed before lowering her eyes back to the page. "Claire visited after dinner and thanked Emily for helping today." Emily changed the subject. My sister immediately snapped the book shut. "This proves nothing," she said much too quickly. "It's just Mom's version of one day." Mom calmly reopened the book to another page. Then another. Then another. Different months. Different years. The pattern never changed. One entry described me leaving work halfway through a 12-hour shift to drive 3 hours because Mom had fallen and insisted she didn't need an ambulance. Another recorded a furnace replacement I'd quietly paid for during the middle of winter after Mom's heating system failed. A third noted that I'd arranged home nursing visits after one of Mom's surgeries because my own schedule made staying overnight impossible. Beside nearly every entry appeared the same handwritten reminder: "Emily asked me not to tell anyone." Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't shocked because I'd helped Mom. They were shocked because none of them had known. Claire had spent years describing herself as the only daughter carrying responsibility, while I apparently contributed almost nothing. The journal wasn't proving that Claire never helped. It was proving that the story had never been as one-sided as everyone believed. Claire suddenly laughed again, though this time there was desperation beneath the sound. "Mom, you're forgetting something important," she said. "I was there almost every day. Emily wasn't." Mom looked at her with remarkable patience. "You're right," she replied. "You were physically here much more often." Claire immediately nodded. "Exactly," Mom continued before she could say anything else. "But being present and being responsible are not always the same thing." My sister's expression hardened. "What is that supposed to mean?" Mom carefully turned to another section near the back of the journal, where colored tabs divided the pages differently from the earlier entries. "When my arthritis became worse," she explained, "I started writing down not only who visited, but who actually solved the problem I needed solved." She slid the book across the table toward my Aunt Linda instead of toward Claire. "You read this one." Linda adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud. "January 19th. Water heater burst at 2:15 in the morning. Called Claire, no answer. Didn't leave voicemail because I knew she worked early. Called Emily. She arranged an emergency plumber before I finished cleaning the kitchen floor. Emily paid the invoice and argued with the insurance company for 3 weeks until they reimbursed me. Claire visited that Saturday with groceries and flowers. Linda looked up slowly, then continued turning pages almost on instinct. March 3rd. Emily scheduled eye surgery after spending her lunch break calling 3 specialists. Another page. August 21st. Claire posted pictures from our doctor's appointment online. Emily attended by speakerphone because she couldn't leave the pediatric oncology unit. Doctor answered every one of Emily's questions. Another page. December 11th. Emily spent Christmas bonus for placing the roof over the guest bedroom. Asked me not to tell anyone because family isn't an investment. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even looked at me. Did I? They were all looking at Claire. Jess. She stood perfectly still beside the birthday cake. Her lips pressed tightly together as though she were searching for one explanation capable of undoing 12 years of carefully documented truth. Then, for the first time that afternoon, she looked directly at me instead of at the room. How long? Jew, she asked quietly. Procedure. Have you been planning this? Claire's question hung in the air for several seconds before anyone realized how strange it sounded. She hadn't asked whether the journal was accurate. She hadn't claimed the entries were false. Instead, she looked directly at me and demanded to know how long I had been planning this, as though the existence of 12 years of handwritten records somehow proved I had orchestrated an elaborate trap. I slowly shook my head. I didn't even know the book existed, I answered honestly. I'm seeing it for the first time. Claire laughed dismissively and turned back toward the family. Seriously, we're supposed to believe that, she asked. Emily works in a hospital. She documents everything. Mom suddenly has 12 years of perfect notes, and we're expected to think that's just a coincidence. Her confidence returned for a brief moment because she understood something about public arguments that most people don't. If you can create enough confusion, certainty becomes impossible. She didn't need everyone to believe she was innocent. She only needed them to wonder whether the truth was more complicated than it appeared. Mom closed the journal gently and looked at Claire with an expression that wasn't angry or disappointed. It was simply tired. I knew you would say that, she said quietly. That's why the journal isn't the only thing I kept. Claire's smile disappeared again. My mother reached beneath the back cover and carefully removed the thick envelope that had been tucked inside the leather binding. Unlike the journal pages, which were filled with handwritten notes, the envelope contained neatly organized documents separated by colored tabs. The first section held hospital appointment summaries with my name listed as the emergency contact. Sterile another contained invoices from contractors, plumbers, and electricians, each marked paid beside online transaction confirmations. Several pharmacy receipts were stapled together with prescription records showing my credit card ending in the same 4 digits I still carried today. Mom laid the stack on the dining table without drama. The journal helped me remember, pat her softly. The paperwork helped me make sure my memory was right. No one reached for the documents at first. It was my cousin David, an accountant who questioned everything by habit, who finally picked up the first bundle. He spent nearly a minute silently comparing dates between the journal and the receipts before looking toward me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't sympathy. It was embarrassment. These match, he said quietly. Every date I've checked so far matches exactly. Aunt Linda accepted another stack and found the same thing. The hospital discharge summaries lined up with the journal entries. Insurance claim numbers matched repair invoices. Bank confirmations reflected the exact payments Mom had described years earlier. None of it looked prepared for a confrontation, because none of it had been organized to prove anyone wrong. It looked like the careful filing system of a woman who feared forgetting pieces of her own life. That ordinary detail made the evidence far more convincing than anything I could have collected after the fact. Claire folded her arms tightly across her chest. "Fine," she said with forced calm. "Emily helped more than people realized. I never denied she did some things." Several relatives looked toward her in surprise because that wasn't what she'd been saying 20 minutes earlier. She quickly corrected herself. "What I meant was that I handled almost everything else. You can't honestly expect one notebook to erase 12 years of reality." Mom nodded gently. "You're right again," she replied. "One notebook shouldn't erase reality. That's exactly why I kept writing." She turned several pages toward the final section, where the handwriting became noticeably shorter and more structured. At the top of every page appeared the same heading: "Conversations I Need to Remember." I frowned because this section looked different from everything else. Instead of recording appointments or expenses, Mom had documented important discussions, almost like meeting notes. She explained quietly. "About 6 years ago, I noticed something unusual. Family members kept thanking Claire for things I knew Emily had done. At first, I assumed they were simple misunderstandings. Then the misunderstandings became patterns." Claire shifted her weight uneasily but remained silent. Mom continued. "When the same story changes often enough, you begin wondering whether your memory is failing or someone else's version is simply louder." Aunt Linda began reading one of the entries aloud. "April 17th. Claire told the family she spent all weekend repainting my guest bedroom. Emily actually hired the painters after I refused to let her drive here during 3 consecutive overnight shifts. Claire came by Sunday afternoon and posted pictures after the work was finished. I decided not to correct anyone because Emily asked me not to." Another page described a Thanksgiving dinner where relatives praised Claire for replacing my mother's refrigerator. The attached invoice showed I had purchased the appliance online 3 days earlier, while Claire coordinated the delivery because she happened to be nearby. Another entry documented a roof repair, a dental procedure, a wheelchair ramp, and dozens of smaller moments that all followed the same pattern. Claire often appeared at the final step of a problem after someone else, usually me, had already solved it. She rarely told outright lies. Instead, she quietly allowed everyone to assume that being present at the end meant she had carried the responsibility from the beginning. For the first time all afternoon, I finally understood why I had never felt angry before. Claire hadn't stolen money from me. She hadn't stolen gifts or opportunities. She had stolen something much harder to notice. She had slowly collected recognition that belonged to other people, until even she seemed to believe it was rightfully hers. Every compliment from relatives, every grateful comment on social media, every Mother's Day speech praising her devotion had reinforced a version of reality that grew stronger each year. I had mistaken silence for kindness. Claire had mistaken silence for permission. Somewhere along the way, those two choices collided until they created the moment we were living through now. My husband, Daniel, quietly cleared his throat from the other side of the table. He had remained silent since Claire's accusation because he respected my family's right to resolve its own conflicts. Now he looked toward Mom and asked the question no one else seemed willing to ask. "Margaret, If you knew this was happening for so many years, why didn't you stop it? The room fell silent again. Mom lowered her eyes to the journal before answering. Because I thought I could love my daughters into becoming honest with each other. She smiled sadly. Every time Claire accepted credit she didn't earn, I planned to correct it later when we were alone. Every time Emily told me not to say anything, I convinced myself she was protecting peace. I kept believing the next birthday, the next Christmas, the next family dinner would finally be the moment we talked openly. She looked from me to Claire. Instead, every year made the truth heavier. Claire suddenly pulled out her phone and held it in the air. "You know what?" she said sharply. "If everyone wants proof, let's look at proof." She unlocked her social media account and turned the screen toward the room. Photograph after photograph showed her beside Mom at doctor's offices, grocery stores, birthday lunches, church events, and holiday dinners. "This is what 12 years of showing up actually looks like," she declared. "Pictures don't lie." Mom looked at the phone. Mom looked, then back at the journal. Then she quietly asked one question. Madam Dime, Claire, would you mind that precipitation showing everyone? Prosecutor, the dates those pictures were uploaded. Claire hesitated for the first time that afternoon, and it was only a fraction of a second, but everyone in the room noticed it. She quickly recovered, forced another smile onto her face, and unlocked her phone with exaggerated confidence. "Gladly," she replied, scrolling through dozens of photographs. "I've never hidden anything." She turned the screen toward the nearest relatives, proudly displaying pictures of herself beside Mom in hospital waiting rooms, standing next to grocery carts overflowing with food, smiling on the front porch after what appeared to be long afternoons spent helping around the house. At first glance, the images supported everything she had claimed for years. Aunt Linda nodded slowly while looking through them. "There are certainly a lot of pictures," she admitted. Claire folded her arms triumphantly. "Exactly. You can't fake 12 years of showing up." Mom waited until everyone had seen enough before quietly asking David to open the first photograph instead of simply looking at the preview. David enlarged the image and frowned almost immediately. "This picture was uploaded on April 17th, he said. Claire nodded eagerly. "That's the day I took Mom to her cardiologist." Without saying a word, Mom slid the journal across the table and opened it to the matching date. David compared both pages before looking up again. "The upload date is April 17th, he said slowly. But the metadata says the picture itself was taken on April 15th. Claire shrugged. "So I didn't post it right away." David continued reading. According to the journal, Emily drove Mom to the appointment on April 17th. This photograph was taken 2 days earlier while Mom was picking up lab work, not during the cardiology visit. The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire reached for another explanation almost instantly. "People don't always post photos the same day. Everyone knows that." "No," Mom answered softly. "They don't." She turned another page. "Ma, please check the next one." David opened a second photograph showing Claire smiling beside Mom in front of a newly installed wheelchair ramp. The caption read, "Spent all weekend making sure Mom can safely get around. Family always comes first." More than 100 relatives and friends had reacted with heart emojis years earlier. David examined the information attached to the image before looking toward me. "The photo was taken 3 days after the ramp was installed," he said carefully. "And according to the contractor invoice, Emily paid for it and arranged the installation while she was working in Nashville. Claire immediately interrupted. I never said I built the ramp myself. Her voice had become sharper than before. I was there. I checked on Mom. I made sure everything looked right. Nobody answered her because, for the first time, everyone had begun noticing the same pattern. The photographs weren't false. They simply captured the final 5 minutes of situations someone else had spent days solving. My cousin Melissa quietly asked to see Claire's phone. Just one more, she said gently. Claire hesitated before handing it over. Melissa opened a Christmas photograph showing Claire placing a blanket around Mom's shoulders, while dozens of comments praised her devotion. Then she looked at the journal entry for the same week. Mom had written only one sentence beneath the date. Emily stayed overnight after my fever returned. Claire visited for dessert after work. She brought my favorite pie. Melissa slowly lowered the phone into her lap. These pictures aren't documenting the work, she whispered almost to herself. They're documenting the ending. No one accused Claire of fabricating images because she hadn't. Instead, she had learned something far more effective. She arrived after the difficult part was over, took photographs during the visible moments everyone else could understand, then quietly allowed those images to become the entire story. Social media hadn't created the lie. It had simply made an incomplete truth look complete. Claire looked around the room and realized the mood had changed. She immediately switched strategies. Fine, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe Emily helped more than people realized. I never said she did nothing. I stared at her in disbelief, because barely 30 minutes earlier she had publicly called me a gold digger who only visited when she wanted an inheritance. Before I could respond, Daniel quietly spoke for the first time since the photographs were examined. Claire, he said evenly, this morning you told everyone Emily visited your mother only 3 times this year. Claire nodded cautiously. That's what Mom told me. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he looked toward Mom. Margaret, how many times did Emily actually visit? Mom didn't answer immediately. She reached into the back of the leather journal once more and removed a folded calendar covered with small blue check marks. I stopped counting after people kept asking, she admitted. So I started marking every visit. She handed the calendar to Aunt Linda. Emily's name appeared beside 48 separate dates. Due. Some visits lasted an afternoon. They've been so. Others lasted less than an hour because I drove down after overnight shifts simply to check on Mom before driving back to work again. Several happened without anyone else in the family ever knowing because they occurred on ordinary Tuesdays or Wednesday mornings when everyone assumed I was still in Nashville. So the room fell completely silent. Down 48 visits. 9, not 3. 2, 48. 1 million. Claire stared at the calendar as though it belonged to someone else. Something that can't be right. Mom smiled sadly. I thought perhaps I was remembering incorrectly too. That's why I kept my gas receipts. She reached into the envelope again and placed a small stack of fuel receipts beside the calendar. Almost every one had been highlighted with the words, "Trip to Mom," written across the top in my handwriting, because I tracked mileage for work whenever I swapped shifts. David quietly compared several receipts with my nursing schedule, then looked toward Claire. They match. Every date. Now, every trip to HOA, every mile. Up your back. Claire's breathing became noticeably quicker. For the first time since the party began, she stopped looking at the rest of the family and focused entirely on Mom. "You kept all of this?" she asked weakly. Mom nodded. "Not because I expected today to happen. Because your father always told me, memories become arguments when nobody writes them down." She gently rested one hand on the journal. "I prayed I would never need to open this book." My Uncle Robert leaned back slowly in his chair and looked at Claire with visible disappointment. "Then why," he asked quietly, "did you tell all of us Emily barely came here?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked toward me as though expecting me to rescue her the same way I always had, by changing the subject or minimizing another uncomfortable moment. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't. I simply sat beside my mother and waited. Claire finally found her voice. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Haman, I never thought. Processors." Mom was keeping records too. Claire's words echoed through the dining room with far more force than I think she intended. I never thought Mom was keeping records too. The instant she said them, she realized what everyone else had just heard. She hadn't denied exaggerating the truth. She hadn't insisted the journal was inaccurate. Instead, she admitted she simply hadn't expected my mother to document what was really happening. David slowly lowered the calendar onto the table and looked at her, with the careful expression accountants wear when they realize someone has accidentally confessed before they finished asking questions. "Claire," he said quietly, "that's a strange thing to say if you've been telling the truth all along." My sister opened her mouth, closed it again, then forced an uneasy laugh. "You're twisting my words. I only meant Mom never mentioned writing any of this down." Nobody responded. For the first time all afternoon, Claire's explanations weren't convincing anyone, not because they were impossible, but because every new answer seemed to create a bigger question than the one before it. Mom reached for a glass of water before speaking again. Her hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from exhaustion. "Claire," she said softly, "I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like you to answer honestly. Do you remember the night my furnace stopped working during that snowstorm 4 winters ago?" Claire nodded immediately. "Of course I do. I came over the next morning." Mom smiled sadly. "Yes, you did." Then she turned another page in the journal. "Do you remember telling everyone at church that you spent the entire night keeping me warm because Emily couldn't get here?" Claire's face tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't remember exactly how I said it." Mom didn't argue. Instead, she opened another folder inside the envelope and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Uncle Robert. It wasn't a receipt or a photograph. It was a visitor log from the gated retirement community where Mom had temporarily stayed while repairs were being completed on the house. My name appeared on the sign-in sheet at 11:42 that night. Claire's appeared the following morning at 9:18. 8 different staff members had signed the log throughout the evening. There was nothing dramatic about the document, which somehow made it impossible to dismiss. The room remained painfully quiet until Aunt Linda finally asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to say aloud. "Claire, why?" She didn't sound angry. She sounded genuinely confused. "You helped your mother. Nobody is denying that. Why keep making it sound like you did everything yourself?" Claire looked around the room, searching for an ally, but every familiar face now reflected uncertainty instead of admiration. Her eyes eventually settled on me. For just a moment, I saw the frightened younger sister I remembered from childhood instead of the confident woman who had spent years controlling every family conversation. "Because nobody noticed me," she whispered. Several relatives frowned, unsure they'd heard correctly. Claire wiped away a tear before continuing. "Dad always talked about Emily. She was the smart one, the responsible one, the nurse, the one saving children's lives." She laughed bitterly. "Do you know what people used to ask me at church? How's your amazing little sister doing?" Nobody ever asked how I was. I stared at her in disbelief. During our entire childhood, I'd believed Claire was the favorite. She was captain of the volleyball team, homecoming queen, and the daughter who never seemed to struggle in school. I had spent years trying to catch up to the effortless confidence she projected. Hearing her describe our family through such a different lens felt like discovering we'd grown up in two completely separate houses. Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Claire," she said gently, "your father adored both of you." Claire shook her head immediately. "He respected Emily," she replied. "That's different." Her voice cracked as years of carefully hidden resentment finally surfaced. Then Emily moved away, and for the first time, everyone looked at me. People thanked me. They admired me. They told me I was a wonderful daughter. She lowered her eyes to the floor. At first, I only forgot to correct them. After a while, it became easier to let them keep believing it. Nobody interrupted her. Sometimes the truth arrives so quietly that arguing with it feels almost cruel. I understood, perhaps for the first time, how an ordinary insecurity could slowly transform into something destructive without anyone noticing. Claire hadn't started by inventing elaborate lies. She had started by accepting compliments that belonged to someone else. Then she discovered how easily a carefully chosen photograph, a vague story, or an unanswered assumption could reinforce the image people already wanted to believe. Each small decision became the foundation for the next, until the version of herself she presented to the family no longer resembled the person sitting across the table. That understanding didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained how she reached this moment without ever stopping to ask herself when exaggeration had become deception. I thought the conversation might finally be over, but Mom quietly reached beneath the journal one last time. "There's something else," she said. Claire's head lifted instantly. "No," she whispered, almost pleading. Mom closed her eyes for a brief moment before continuing. "I promised myself I would never show this unless one of you publicly accused the other of loving me for money." She removed a sealed envelope with both our names written across the front. "Your father asked me to keep this with the journal." Claire stared at the envelope in open disbelief. "Dad wrote that." Mom nodded. "A month before he died." She carefully unfolded the letter, but instead of reading the entire page, she skipped directly to one paragraph she had clearly marked years earlier. "If my girls are ever fighting over who loved us more," Dad had written, "then they've already forgotten the only thing your mother and I ever wanted them to understand. Love isn't measured by who was seen helping. It's measured by who helped even when nobody was watching. If either of you ever turns quiet sacrifice into a competition, you've both already lost." My throat tightened as Mom lowered the page. "That's why I never wanted this journal to become a scoreboard," she whispered. "It wasn't written to decide who deserved more. It was written so I wouldn't forget the people who quietly carried me when I needed them." For several long moments, Claire cried without trying to hide it. The room remained silent out of respect rather than discomfort. Then she slowly looked toward me for the first time all afternoon, without anger, without sarcasm, and without the practiced confidence she'd worn for years. "Emily," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, Uncle Robert gently raised one hand. "No," he said firmly. "Jim, you owe everyone the truth. The truth." Claire looked around the room at 43 relatives who had believed her story for more than a decade. She took a slow breath. "Don't know." Then she said the words she had spent 12 years avoiding. I lied." Claire's confession settled over the dining room with a silence so complete that even the children playing in the backyard seemed impossibly far away. No one rushed to comfort her. No one shouted at her either. The relatives who had spent years praising her devotion simply stared, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one standing in front of them, admitting she had built that reputation on half-truths. I looked around the room and realized something unexpected. Nobody was looking at me with sympathy. They were looking at themselves. One by one, they began remembering birthday dinners, church gatherings, hospital visits, and holiday conversations where they had accepted Claire's version of events without ever asking a single question. The room wasn't just filled with disappointment. It was filled with regret. Uncle Robert was the first to speak. "Claire," he said quietly, "I don't think anyone here believes you never helped your mother. We all know you did. But you stood in front of everyone today and called your sister a gold digger." His voice remained calm, but every word landed with unmistakable weight. "You didn't just make yourself look better. You tried to destroy Emily's character to protect the story you've been telling for years." Claire lowered her head without arguing. Aunt Linda slowly reached across the table and closed the leather journal, almost as though she wanted to protect it from becoming part of the argument any longer. "Margaret kept records because she was afraid of forgetting," she said softly. "She never imagined we'd use them to remember how badly we failed each other." I finally found my voice after what felt like hours of listening. "I don't need everyone to apologize to me," I said quietly. "I never wanted credit." Several relatives immediately looked toward me, but I continued before anyone could interrupt. "I became a nurse because I believe some of the most important things people do happen when nobody is watching. Taking care of Mom never felt like a favor. She spent her whole life taking care of us." I turned toward Claire, who still refused to lift her eyes from the floor. "What hurts isn't that people thanked you. What hurts is that you let them believe I didn't care whether Mom was alone." My voice cracked, despite every effort to stay composed. "You didn't steal compliments from me. You stole years that I can never get back. Years when people quietly believed I had abandoned the woman I loved most." Claire wiped away another tear before speaking again. "I know," she whispered, "and every year it became harder to tell the truth." She looked directly at me for the first time since admitting she had lied. "The first few times people thanked me, I told myself it didn't matter because you never wanted attention anyway. Then people started introducing me as the daughter who does everything. I should have corrected them. She paused, struggling to breathe evenly. Instead, I started believing I deserved it because I lived closer. Then, when you quietly handled something behind the scenes, it became easier to pretend I'd done more than I had. She laughed bitterly at herself. By the time Dad's friends started calling me the daughter who sacrificed everything, I didn't know how to admit I'd built that reputation one small lie at a time. Mom reached across the table and gently covered Claire's trembling hand with her own. It would have been easy for her to rescue the moment, to tell everyone that family mattered more than mistakes and encourage us all to move on. Instead, she did something much harder. She looked at Claire with unmistakable love and said, "An apology begins healing. It doesn't erase consequences." Claire slowly nodded because she already understood. Mom turned toward the rest of the family. For 12 years, Emily protected my peace by refusing to defend herself. Today, I won't allow that silence to continue. She looked directly at my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, and the lifelong family friends filling the room. Every one of you has repeated this story at some point. Some of you told Emily she should visit more often. Others thanked Claire for things she never actually did. None of you acted out of cruelty. You simply accepted the loudest version of the truth. Her voice remained gentle, but nobody could escape the quiet conviction behind it. I hope today reminds all of us that confidence is not evidence. One by one, the people around the table began speaking. Cousin Melissa apologized for forwarding Claire's social media post to distant relatives while praising her dedication. Uncle Robert admitted he'd privately criticized me after hearing Claire describe another missed holiday. Aunt Linda confessed she'd once told her own daughters they should grow up to be more like Claire, believing she was celebrating selflessness when she was actually rewarding performance. Every apology hurt in its own way, because each one revealed another moment I'd never known existed. Yet with every admission, something else happened too. The story Claire had spent years constructing began collapsing in public, piece by piece, before the same audience that had accepted it without question. No shouting was necessary. No dramatic confrontation could have accomplished more than watching the truth quietly replace assumption. Just as I believed the afternoon had finally reached its end, Mom looked toward the unopened birthday gift stacked beside the fireplace. "Emily," she said softly, "would you hand me the blue envelope?" I frowned because I hadn't noticed an envelope among the presents earlier. It was tucked beneath a wrapped photo frame, my name written across the front in Mom's careful handwriting. "I wasn't planning to give this to you today," she admitted after I handed it over. "I intended to wait until Christmas." Inside was a folded document from her attorney. Before anyone could misunderstand, Mom smiled and shook her head. "It's not a will." She looked directly at Claire before continuing. "After your father died, we created something called a family letter. It has no legal authority. It simply explains decisions we hoped nobody would ever have to question." She unfolded the page and read only a single paragraph aloud. "To our daughters, if you're reading this because someone believes our love could be measured by money, they've misunderstood us completely. Our estate will always be divided equally because our love was never divided unequally. But if anyone ever asks which daughter carried us through our hardest years, the answer is simple. One carried us by being present. The other carried us by quietly making sure we never fell. We needed both. Mom lowered the paper and smiled sadly. Your father insisted on writing that sentence himself. Claire broke down completely. Not because she had lost an inheritance, there had never been one to lose, but because she finally understood what she had been chasing all those years. She wanted to be seen as the better daughter, when our parents had never asked either of us to compete in the first place. Just as relatives slowly began gathering their coats to leave, something happened that surprised me more than anything else that afternoon. Cousin David walked over to the birthday cake, picked up the microphone we'd rented for speeches, and tapped it gently against the table. Before everyone goes, he said, I'd like to correct something. The room gradually grew quiet again. David looked around at every member of our family before continuing. For years, we've thanked the wrong person for a lot of things. Today isn't about embarrassing Claire any further. She's already admitted the truth. He turned toward me. This is about making sure the truth is finally said out loud. Then, in front of every relative who had once laughed at Claire's accusation, he smiled warmly and said, Emily, thank you for loving Aunt Margaret, even when nobody was watching. No applause followed. Men, nobody thought applause was enough. Instead, one after another, my family stood up. Anne walked across the room, and hugged me. The last guest didn't leave until almost 9 that evening. By then, the birthday cake had gone untouched for hours. The balloons had begun losing their shape, and the dining room looked nothing like the cheerful celebration we'd planned that morning. Empty coffee cups sat beside unopened presents, chairs had been pushed out of place, and the leather journal remained exactly where my mother had closed it after reading my father's letter. I helped clear the dishes in silence while Daniel loaded leftover food into containers for relatives who insisted they weren't hungry but accepted them anyway. Every few minutes, someone stopped beside me, apologized again, and quietly admitted they wished they had asked more questions over the years, instead of accepting whatever story reached them first. I appreciated every apology, but by then, I was too emotionally exhausted to know how to respond. 12 years of misunderstanding had finally been corrected in a single afternoon, yet it felt impossible to process all at once. Clara stayed behind after everyone else left. She didn't offer to help clean the kitchen the way she normally would after family gatherings. Instead, she remained seated at the dining room table, staring at the empty champagne glass she had used for the toast that started everything. The confidence she carried into the party had disappeared completely. For the first time in my life, she looked less like my older sister and more like someone who had finally become tired of pretending to be someone else. Mom quietly poured 3 cups of tea before sitting between us. None of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Claire broke the silence. I don't expect either of you to forgive me tonight, she said softly. Honestly, I don't know if I'd forgive me either. She looked toward me, her eyes red from crying. But there are things you deserve to know that I should have admitted years ago. She took a slow breath before continuing. Do you remember Dad's retirement dinner? I nodded immediately. It had been nearly 14 years earlier, only a few months before his cancer diagnosis. Claire smiled sadly. That was the first time I lied about you. I frowned in confusion because I couldn't remember anything unusual about that evening. One of Dad's coworkers thanked me for taking care of Grandma after her surgery, Claire explained. I almost corrected him because you'd actually driven her to every appointment. Then he said, "Your parents must be proud to have such a dependable daughter." She laughed bitterly. I wish I could tell you I fixed the misunderstanding. I didn't. I liked hearing those words too much. She lowered her eyes to the table. Everything after that became easier. Not because I wanted to hurt you, because I became addicted to being admired. Mom listened without interrupting. When Claire finished speaking, she reached into the cabinet and placed an old family photo album on the table. It wasn't the leather journal or another collection of evidence. It was simply the album we had looked through every Christmas when Dad was still alive. Mom opened it to a picture of Claire and me standing beside a lemonade stand we'd built one summer as children. I couldn't have been older than 9. Claire was 12. We were both covered in grass stains, laughing so hard that neither of us had noticed Dad taking the photograph. "Do you remember what happened that day?" Mom asked. Claire studied the picture before quietly shaking her head. Mom smiled. "You earned $43 selling lemonade." Claire nodded faintly. "Photographers." "Then you insisted Emily keep $22 because she smiled at every customer, even when nobody bought anything." I had forgotten the story entirely until that moment. Mom gently touched the photograph. "You weren't always competing with each other. Once upon a time, you celebrated each other." Daniel quietly excused himself to finish loading the dishwasher, giving the 3 of us the privacy we needed. Mom looked from one daughter to the other before speaking again. "I made a mistake too," she admitted. Claire looked up in surprise. "No, Mom, this is my fault." Mom nodded. "It is, but that doesn't mean I didn't fail you both in different ways." She folded her hands together, choosing each word carefully. "Every time Emily asked me not to correct the family, I accepted her sacrifice because it kept the peace. Every time Claire accepted praise she hadn't earned, I postponed a difficult conversation because I hoped the problem would solve itself. I confused avoiding conflict with protecting my family." Tears gathered in her eyes. A mother should know the difference. Hearing her say that hurt almost as much as anything else that afternoon, because she wasn't defending herself. She was accepting responsibility without taking it away from either of us. Claire slowly stood from her chair and walked toward me. "There's one more thing," she whispered. "I need to give this back." She reached into her purse and removed a small silver key attached to an old wooden keychain I recognized immediately. It belonged to Dad's workshop. After he died, Claire had told everyone the key had been lost during the move. She placed it carefully in my hand. "I found it years ago," she admitted. "I kept it because I thought if I was the one with Dad's workshop, people would keep coming to me instead of you." I stared at the key in disbelief. It wasn't valuable. The workshop itself had been emptied long ago. But Dad had spent countless evenings teaching me how to build birdhouses, bookshelves, and picture frames inside that tiny garage. Losing the key had always felt like losing the last small piece of him I could still touch. Claire wiped away another tear. I kept telling myself I'd return it tomorrow, then next week, then next year. After a while, admitting I'd lied seemed harder than continuing to hide it. I closed my fingers around the worn key and looked at my sister for a long time before answering. "I'm angry," I admitted honestly. "Probably more angry than I've ever been." Claire nodded silently. "But I'm also tired." I glanced toward the leather journal still resting on the dining table. "Dad wrote something today that I can't stop thinking about. He said love isn't measured by who was seen helping. I think forgiveness works the same way. It's not something people announce. It's something they decide to practice over time. Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, though I could tell she wasn't expecting immediate reconciliation. I'm not saying everything goes back to normal, I continued. Trust doesn't come back because someone says they're sorry. It comes back because they choose honesty every day afterward. She nodded again, this time with quiet understanding instead of hope for an easy ending. 3 months later, our family gathered again for Thanksgiving. It was the first holiday in more than a decade that felt strangely uncomplicated. Claire arrived carrying homemade pies, but left her phone in her purse all afternoon. No photographs, no carefully written captions, no staged moments for social media. When relatives thanked her for bringing dessert, she smiled and simply said, "Emily made the turkey. Mom taught us both." It was a small sentence, almost forgettable. Yet everyone at the table noticed it, because it was the first time in years that she shared recognition instead of collecting it. Mom caught my eye from across the room and smiled quietly. She didn't need the leather journal anymore. The truth no longer depended on written pages. As we finished dinner, Uncle Robert stood to refill his coffee and looked around the table with a grin. "You know," he said, "this family finally stopped keeping score." Mom laughed softly. "No." She looked at the closed journal resting on the bookshelf. "We finally started remembering what was worth counting." A week after Thanksgiving, I drove back to Mom's house on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. There wasn't a holiday, a birthday, or a family gathering waiting for me. I had finished 3 overnight shifts at the children's hospital and should have been sleeping, but something kept pulling me toward the little farmhouse where so much had changed over the previous months. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anxious before pulling into the driveway. I wasn't wondering what version of the story the rest of the family believed anymore, because there was finally only one story left to tell. Mom was sitting on the front porch with a blanket over her knees and a mug of tea warming her hands. She smiled the moment she saw my car, the same quiet smile she'd worn since I was a little girl racing home from school. "You're early," she teased. I laughed. "You taught me that showing up matters more than perfect timing." She patted the chair beside her. "Your father would have liked hearing that." We spent nearly an hour talking about nothing important. We watched squirrels chase each other across the yard, complained about the unusually cold weather, and argued playfully over whether the maple tree needed trimming before winter. It felt wonderfully ordinary, and I realized how much of life is made up of moments nobody thinks to photograph. After a while, Mom disappeared inside the house and returned carrying the old black leather journal. She placed it gently on the small table between us before taking a slow sip of tea. "I think it's time," she said. I looked at the journal in surprise. "Time for what?" She smiled softly. "For me to stop writing in it." I instinctively reached toward the worn cover but hesitated before touching it. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I started that book because I was afraid memory would fail me. Now I know something much more important than memory." She looked directly into my eyes. "The truth doesn't need to be written forever, once people are finally willing to live it." She pushed the journal toward me. "Take it." I immediately shook my head. "Mom, that's yours." She smiled. "No." Her voice remained gentle but certain. "It's part of your story now, too." I slowly opened the cover, expecting to see the familiar pages filled with appointments and handwritten notes. Instead, tucked inside the very last page was a folded envelope with my name written across the front. My heart skipped. "You didn't tell me there was another letter." Mom laughed quietly. "Because there wasn't when all this started." I unfolded the page and instantly recognized her handwriting instead of Dad's. It wasn't a long letter. It didn't mention the birthday party, the arguments, or the painful afternoon that had changed our family forever. Instead, it contained only a few simple paragraphs. "Emily, if you're reading this, then you probably tried to give the journal back. That doesn't surprise me. You've spent your whole life believing love should happen quietly. Never lose that part of yourself. But promise me one thing. Never confuse humility with invisibility again. The people who love you deserve to know who you really are, not just the version that asks for nothing." I read those words twice before quietly folding the letter. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your father used to tell me something after every difficult year," she said. "He'd remind me that silence can be beautiful, but only when it's chosen. Silence forced by fear eventually becomes permission for someone else's lie." I thought about that sentence for a long time, because it perfectly described the mistake I'd been making for more than a decade. I believed I was protecting peace, but in reality, I had been surrendering my own voice. Claire had taken advantage of that silence, but I had also allowed it to continue because speaking up felt uncomfortable. The journal had cleared my name, but the deeper lesson was that truth sometimes requires courage long before it requires evidence. 2 months later, our extended family gathered again, this time for Aunt Linda's anniversary dinner. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from every gathering we'd shared in recent years. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People asked questions instead of making assumptions. My cousins no longer praised whoever spoke the loudest. They listened. Claire arrived carrying a homemade scrapbook she had spent weeks putting together for Aunt Linda, instead of another carefully staged social media post. During dinner, someone complimented her for organizing the decorations. She smiled politely before pointing toward 3 different relatives who had spent the afternoon helping. "It wasn't just me," she said. "We all worked on it together." The sentence lasted less than 10 seconds, but I caught Mom smiling across the room. Change rarely announces itself with dramatic speeches. More often, it reveals itself in ordinary moments, when someone quietly chooses a different habit than the one that once hurt the people they loved. Later that evening, my youngest cousin Sophie wandered over while I was washing dishes in the kitchen. She couldn't have been older than 12, but she had been at Mom's birthday party and remembered more than most adults realized. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. I nodded. "Were you mad when everyone believed Claire?" I smiled honestly. "Yes." She looked down at the dish towel twisting between her fingers. "Then why didn't you try to embarrass her back?" I dried my hands before answering, because I wanted her to remember the response long after the conversation ended. Because proving someone wrong isn't the same thing as proving yourself right. She frowned thoughtfully. I continued. "The truth lasts longer when it doesn't need revenge to survive." Sophie nodded slowly, repeating the sentence under her breath as though she were storing it away for some future day when she might need it herself. But not long after that conversation, Claire quietly walked into the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me before leaning against the counter. "Mom told me what she wrote in your letter," she said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "She tells you everything now?" Claire laughed for the first time without any trace of bitterness. "No, she only told me one sentence." She looked down at her coffee before continuing. "She said she hopes I spend the rest of my life earning trust instead of collecting praise." I smiled because that sounded exactly like Mom. Claire took a deep breath. "I'm still working on it." I nodded. "I know." There wasn't some dramatic hug or perfectly scripted reconciliation. There didn't need to be. Healing wasn't a single conversation. It was hundreds of small choices made after the hardest truth had already been spoken. A year after Mom's birthday, the leather journal rested on a bookshelf in my own